Good evening. It's time to get started with our class tonight. It's good to see everybody. If you have your book, we're going to be in chapter 5 tonight. We're going to start this chapter. Several of you have asked. We're not going to have the PowerPoint tonight. Just strictly, it's been a busy week and I've not had time to put it together. It takes about as long to put the presentation together as it does to study for the lesson. So tonight we're going to stick mainly just with the book. So hopefully you have that. We'll start there on page 1 in chapter 5 talking about creation versus evolution. And I think this is going to be a very interesting study that we'll begin looking at tonight. But before we get into our lesson, David Pierce, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Father, we pray that you would be with each of us as we go through this service. Help us to put aside the cares and the worries of this world. Help us to fully concentrate upon the things that we hear, to study upon them and apply them to our daily lives as Christians. Be with us as we go through our daily lives. Help us to live our lives as Christians should, so that we can be a beacon to others around us and hopefully bring somebody to you. Father, we pray that what Brother Josh has studied for tonight will come readily and easily to his mind, and that he will speak in such a way that will make it easy for all to understand, regardless of education. Father, be with all of us as we struggle through this life. Keep us safe from harm, and speak your will. Give us that home in heaven at the end of time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, up to this point in our study, we've been talking about mainly the existence of God and the arguments for the existence of God. Well, what we're going to begin tonight is taking this a little bit further and looking at this from the standpoint of where did the universe come from? All of the things that we see. And going back to what we've discussed numerous times, this sensory or empirical evidence. All of the things that we can see, touch, taste, smell. All of these things, where did they come from? Well, what we find is, at least on a broad scale, there's two different theories as to where this universe came from. You notice the title of this chapter is Creation versus Evolution. And really, until I started looking over this specific material, I had never really thought of creation or creationism as a theory. You know, those who are people of faith, we look at this and we say, well, no, that's a fact. We believe it. It's a fact. The Bible tells us in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, based upon faith, we accept it as a fact. But the reason why, in scientific terminology, this is referred to as a theory, just as evolution is a theory, is because neither one of those can be proven without a shadow of a doubt based simply upon sensory evidence. Just upon using those 5 natural senses that we have. Neither one of those can be proven just based upon that. And so that is why we see, at least in this study, creation and evolution both described from the standpoint of theories. These are proposed ideas as to how this universe came into existence. But if you notice there in that first paragraph, it talks about how this is not just a concept of where the world came from. Because using the terminology that it uses, it says this is an entire world view. Meaning the way that we view the world and everything in it, the way that we interact with the world, the way that we view even ourselves as human beings. comes down to which one of these theories we accept. Are we going to accept evolution, or are we going to accept creationism? Well, we start out with just kind of a cursory definition of these two theories. Starts out talking about the concept or the theory of evolution. And notice the way that it's described. It's described as the universe being self-contained. And what that means is that there are not any and never have been any external factors that have had anything to do with the development of this universe. And what that states is that today we have all of these complex organisms. You look at the human body with its complexities. You look at plant life, animal life. You look at the entire universe with its complexity. And whenever you trace that back far enough, they say that what you find are natural processes that have brought us to where we are today. That everything can be explained on the basis of nature. And the argument is made that all life. Now, this is where it gets kind of far-fetched. You know, I've often heard it said that it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in creation. Because the argument is that all life, as we think of life today, be it human life, animal life, plant life, whatever the case may be, all started from one source. And that source was made up of just one single cell. Well, you may remember back in our introduction, we talked about how life is found in this cellular system of plants, animals, human beings. Life is found within the cells. Well, evolutionists, well, they say, well, this started out as just this single cell organism. More than likely something that was so small that it couldn't even be seen with the human eye. And then over time, that became 2 cells, 4 cells, and just continued to evolve and multiply over time to where we finally, over millions and billions of years, or as the book says, over eons of time, have finally evolved to where we are today. You see, it's kind of far-fetched. Well, and that was the next point, because if you look in the book, it says that evolutionists claim that that single cell organism had to have originated with something that was a lifeless form. Well, that's one of the arguments that we're going to talk about as we get further into this chapter. Science has proven unequivocally that life can only come from life. The only way to produce life is for another life form to bring it about. So here we have those who are trying to find a way to explain this idea of evolution. Well, the only thing logically in their minds that they can come to is, well, before you have a single cell organism, you have to have a no cell organism. Well, any type of substance that does not have cellular life has no life. And so, looking at that, they cannot, based upon this system, based upon their arguments, give any type of, at least by our estimation, logical arguments as to where the world came from. How do we have life when at one point there was no life? Where did that single cell come from? If there was not a cellular structure there, then how did that just evolve over time? There's no explanation for that. They're not able to answer that question. Well, then we have the concept or the theory of creation. And the theory of creation says that this universe is not self-contained, and that the processes that we see taking place are not based upon natural processes, but they are based upon supernatural workings of God. or for that matter, not necessarily, depending upon what religion you adhere to, not necessarily the God of the Bible, but just a supreme being. So looking at this concept, they say, well, no, it didn't start with just this no-cell organism to a one-cell, then all the way up to where we are now billions of years later. What creation argues is that we see, and we saw this when we were talking about the existence of God, we see design, we see purpose, and we see deliberate actions taken by God, by a supernatural creator. But those processes that God used are not processes that are continuing to happen today. How did God create everything? Go back to Genesis chapter 1. How did God create everything? He spoke it into existence. Is there anything being spoken into existence today? No. God created all things, but then you remember the Bible talks about God set those things in motion. God is the one that established the natural processes that happen today, that keep the world functioning the way that it does. But creation has never been a natural process. Creation is a supernatural process. Now with that, in talking about the subject of creation, we see that creation, what sets it apart from evolution, evolution claims that complex life happened over billions of years. That it wasn't something that just happened immediately, meaning it wasn't just spoken into existence. Creation says no. It says all life was simply spoken into existence, and it was immediately created in the form that God wanted it to be in. When God created Adam from the dust of the ground, God created him with that full, complex, molecular and cellular structure that makes up a human being. He didn't create him as a caveman that eventually evolved over time into what we see today, as some would have us to believe. You know, there's a whole other area of thought that we'll talk about later on that's known as theistic evolution, that says that evolution is actually a natural process, but God is the one that created it and set it in motion. Well, we'll talk about that as we get further on into this study. But I think that what we'll see is, that's ridiculous. I mean, there's nothing that indicates that. Because when we read through Genesis chapter 1, first off, what did God say? Let there be light. Well, did the universe evolve to where we have the sun, the moon, and the stars over billions of years? No, what did it say? Let there be light, and there was light. And we see that with all of the other acts of creation. It was immediate, wasn't it? When he created the fish and the birds, when he created plant life, when he divided the waters from the firmament, when he created human life, it was immediate. It was instantaneous. It was not something that had to evolve over time. It's not something that had to, kind of rev itself up and work itself up until it got to that proper state. No. God, when he created the world, he created it in that perfect state. Complex organisms and all. But evolution says no, says all of the species that we see on Earth today, they appeared gradually. And that's why they look at human beings and they try to trace us back through other species that somewhat resemble human beings. And say, well, said human beings, as I mentioned a while ago, the cavemen, the Neanderthals, all of those, and then they go on back. Well, then, we look kind of similar to monkeys, so I guess that must have been the step before that. And they just keep moving further on back until guess what we come back to? That single-celled organism. And they say, well, over time you see this progression of evolution to where the species that exists today has come up gradually. Well, the question that I want to ask is, okay, well, what's going to be next? If evolution is a continual process, what's man going to evolve into next? No one's able to answer that question. And so we see the difference. Evolution says that life came about gradually over millions of years, billions of years. Creation says no. These complex life forms, they came about immediately when that supreme being spoke it into existence. Now, it gets a little bit deeper as we get down there to the bottom of page 1, and it starts talking about it. And I had never heard these terms used in this way before, vertical evolution or horizontal evolution. I've never heard those terms used before. But whenever we look at the terms there that it uses, macro and micro evolution, I've heard those terms. I never really fully understood what they meant. But ultimately what this is saying is that in creation, we believe somewhat in a form of evolution. And let me expound upon that just a little bit. Because notice as it says, we deny this vertical or macro evolution, meaning that we all came from this one simple life form, that we've all evolved over billions of years to where we are today. But there is another form of evolution, and I don't think evolution is really the best term to use in this case, but scientifically it is the term that's used. And it's this term microevolution, which means, as we would say, adaptation. Over time, species, they change. Not every human being looks alike, do they? You can talk. Not every human being looks alike, do they? No. You look at those who live in certain parts of the world. Over time, due to the elements and things of that nature, they take on slightly different appearances. There's people that live in parts of the world where it's very cold most of the year, where their skin even begins to thicken a little bit. So we see these changes, these adaptations over time. Does that mean that the species itself is changing? No. Look at it from animal life. How many different types of dog are there?
5,000 different breeds.
Okay, over 5,000 different breeds. Are they all canines?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are they all dogs?
Yeah.
Yes.
They're canine.
Some are that big. Some are little bitty. They look different. But they're all dogs, aren't they? You look at this from any number of different types of species, forms that are out there. How many different types of trees are there? How many different types of flowers are out there? We think of other forms of animals. How many different breeds of cattle are there? I know that there's several of us here that enjoy raising chickens. How many different types of chickens are there? So you look at that. Over time, we see that species are able to have gradual changes over time, but it doesn't mean that that species itself is changing into a different form of species. For instance, we don't see dogs changing into cats. We don't see human beings turning into monkeys. We don't see that type of changes among species. We see variations. We see different changes. And that's what this is talking about from the standpoint of microevolution. It's more adaptation. And looking at it from that standpoint, that is something that we believe. That is something we accept. It's something that we're able to see. We accept that. And I know when I was in school, they always talked about, the moths who would adapt over time so that they would blend in with the tree trunks so that the birds wouldn't be able to spot them and come and eat them. Or we think about is it an iguana that's able to change its skin color based upon whatever material it's up against so that it's a defense mechanism. These are chameleon. So you see, these are things that adapted over time to its surroundings. Yes, sir.
There's a lesson that I give on the ark and why it is entirely possible that two of every animal was able to get on it, and one I use is the 5,000 breeds of dogs. But in researching that, I come across an article from scientists that said if you took young couples in their early 20s, moved them to Alaska, and they had kids, and some other families, and their kids got together, by the fourth generation, the children would be born looking more like what we call Eskimos, with a thicker skin, a thicker bodies. It only takes 4 generations for people to adapt to it.
It's true. And that was just one example. You look at those who live in desert climates. Generally they are darker skinned. And it's so many of those things that we can point to. Does that mean that the species itself has changed? No. It means that that's just a variation, an adaptation based upon that climate or that part of the world. Environmental, yes.
This is an extreme, but I was born and raised in Memphis. 101 degrees, 101% relative humidity. So on a hot day, I can walk out Pocahontas and I think, oh, this is really nice weather. Because my body was so adapted to the Memphis heat and humidity. Unless you were born there and grew up there, you can't grasp what I'm talking about.
Right. And we see that with so many different aspects that we can look at, that we can point to, that we can say, this is just the body's natural ability to adapt. This isn't a change in the species. It's not a mutation that's taking place. It's just the body's natural ability to adapt. And so really, that's where we come to with this. If we are going to accept the theory of evolution, then we have to say that everything is continually evolving. And that eventually one day we're going to get to the point where man is no more. For man will have evolved into something else. Because they say that evolution is a continual natural process. Species are constantly changing, constantly evolving. And so if we are going to take that 100% naturalistic, evolutionary position, then we're going to have to take the position that one of these days there's not going to be any more human beings on earth. And an argument that we often hear people make is, and I think it's been made in this class since we've been studying this, and I've heard it many times, I've used it many times, if we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Well, you go back and you look at some of the arguments they make. Well, they say, the species of monkey that we evolved from, that species no longer exists. But the monkeys that still exist, they're a different species of monkey, and they've just evolved slower over time. So you see, some of this is just so outlandish in the way that they try to explain these things away. But let's move on. We come there to the top of page 2, and it talks about how this is such a significant issue. Because nearly every aspect of life is going to be affected by what we believe in this matter. If we believe in creation, then our entire worldview is going to be one thing, but if we believe in evolution, it's going to be something entirely different. But something that I found very interesting, and a lot of what we're going to talk about next, it's going to be just verbatim from what we find there in the book, but I think it speaks so much to some of the changes that we see in the culture of the world, the culture here in America, but also, some of the scientific findings that have come out in at least the last the last couple of generations. Notice it talks about there at the top about how all of these different areas have got involved in this. We even see the government trying to get involved in this argument. We see news media, the schools. It talks about all of these different things that are getting involved in trying to take a stand on what is true, or at least what they believe is true. And whether that stand is for creation or for evolution, we see that this is becoming a larger issue every year. But notice some of the statistics here. It starts back in 1981. In 1981, the Associated Press and NBC News found that no less than 86% of people wanted creation to be taught as well as evolution. Meaning, present both of these theories. Lay it out there and let people decide for themselves. Present the evidence for both views. 86% in 1981 wanted that to take place. Now, I don't know how it is today. I'm sure it's probably the same way it was when I was in school. But I can remember being in high school and then also being in college at a Christian college. And our textbooks said nothing at all about creation. Nothing at all about this concept of creation. Everything was taught from an evolutionary point of view. And I can remember being in high school and our teacher, I don't know that she was what we would refer to as a strong Christian. She claimed to believe in God. But she was all the time telling us, well, we may not necessarily agree with all this, but we're required to teach it. Well, then the way that it would be taught as if it was established fact. As I said, then in college, at a Christian college, of course, the teacher had a little bit more leeway into how those things could be taught, and we actually did study the subject of creation alongside evolution. But evolution at that setting was actually taught for what it is, a theory. This is just an idea that's been promoted. It wasn't taught as if it was an established fact. But notice, as your book says, there have been a number of states that have tried to pass laws in recent years requiring that teachers teach both of these theories. That they teach creation and evolution. They teach both of them as theory. And that they leave it up to the students to determine which one they're going to believe. Of course, in every one of those states that have attempted to pass that law, and some actually have got it through their legislature, there have been so many lawsuits that have been brought, there have been so many issues that have arisen that has prevented these things from coming in force. It's kind of like what we're seeing today with all of the states that are trying to pass legislation in regard to abortion. Very, very few of those states that have passed a complete ban on abortion have been able to actually enforce that for very long. Because there's always someone stepping in, trying to block that, trying to change that. Well, we see the same thing when it comes to teaching creation. There's always going to be someone that wants to stir up an issue, that wants to threaten legal recourse. And so even though we see many states that are starting to come around and say, we need to be giving these children the choice, they're not able to do it. They're not able to do it.
And what about in a private school?
Private schools are entirely different.
Okay, you're just talking.
The only way that it would be if they accepted any type of state funding. If it was and I know that there are certain types of private schools, like I think charter schools accept some state funding. If it's something where they are accepting any type of government funding whatsoever, that is when this issue arises. But if it is strictly a private school or a school that is based upon Christian principles, then that changes things.
I know, because my grandchildren, both of them, I'm so lucky because they went to a private Christian school.
Mm-hmm.
And that I can remember having conversations around the table with my daughter and her husband and the kids, and how they brought up the issue of, but that's not the way God said. and so, I mean, I was lucky that my grandchildren had both, were exposed to both theories.
Right. Well, as you look on down through this chapter, I think it's very telling, especially here in this paragraph. You notice it gives you some statistics about every 10 years. Well, there was a time there, you notice the number of those who wanted creation taught declined for a while. To where, what was it there, 1997, you only had 39% who was willing to even consider that God had anything to do with creation. But then you move down to that very last statistic, the one that says there in March 11th, 2000, the New York Times. Now, the New York Times is not necessarily seen as an advocate for Christianity. But a New York Times story, notice that it found 79% of those that were polled felt that the scientific evidence for creation should be included in the curriculum of public schools. So things are starting to change just a little bit. And I think that is a good thing from the standpoint that our society today is reaching this point. On one hand, it's not a good thing. On another hand, it is a good thing. But it's this standpoint of, don't you tell me what to believe. Is that not what we're hearing? Don't you tell me what to believe. You present me with the evidence and I'll make up my own mind. You know, in this area, that's a good thing. You lay out that evidence and you let them decide for themselves what they believe to be the truth. Do what now?
That children decide they will be male or female at a young age,
Well, you know, I have some very strong opinions on that. I think that is a decision that only a child after they reach adulthood should be able to make that kind of decision. I don't think that's a decision that parents need to be making for their child or forcing on their child. Not to mention the fact that, you know, a male cannot become a female and a female cannot become a male. I mean, it's not scientifically possible. Well, and I think that's true. That's true. And I can't remember the age at which that child is able to make that decision. Do what, Earl? 6 years old. No. But here's the thing to think about, folks. Here's the thing to think about. Let's completely remove this from the realm of politics. This is not an issue that has to be talked about from the realm of politics whatsoever. But whenever you look at that kind of thing from the standpoint of what we're looking at here, why couldn't we just make the argument, well, you know, the species is just evolving over time, and that's the next step in the evolutionary process? If we're going to accept evolution, why couldn't we make that argument? We could, couldn't we, Wayne? Sure, we can make that argument. And also, if we completely remove ourselves from what we've talked about the last few weeks, this divine source of morality, anything goes. Whatever you want to believe, whatever you want to do, anything goes. So it brings us all back to this point. And you know, one thing that I struggle with, and I'm sure you do as well, so many people are saying, well, you know, there's certain issues, these are political issues that don't need to be talked about. Well, many of those things are not political issues. They were biblical issues first. And regardless of what the issue is, if it stands opposed to the Word of God, then we as children of God need to be speaking out against it. But anyway, coming back to what we're looking at here, I want to finish this last little thought. We see more and more, and I've shared a lot of different quotes with you to this effect, but we are seeing more and more scientists today who are starting to say, there are legitimate arguments defending the concept of creation. Now, they may not take it so far as to actually accept it, but they're at least coming out saying, there's some pretty good arguments that could be made for this. And that is a big step forward. Big step forward. And then I want you to notice this, and this is what we'll end with tonight. Notice it says, in fact, after over 150 years of Darwinism being the term for evolution, Charles Darwin being the one that devised it, rapidly growing numbers of scientists have become convinced that the natural laws and processes that we now know absolutely exclude the possibility that the universe could have been created from nothing. Very good point. It's only taken 150 years to get to that point. And many are looking at creation as a credible explanation. So I know that as we've looked through some of these previous lessons, we've talked about some very discouraging things. And certainly we look at the world around us and it can be very discouraging at the direction that we see many people taking, many people's views taking. We also see that there are some lights along the road. We see that there are some things that are starting to indicate that at least from a very elementary level, people's eyes are starting to be open to the fact that some of these things we've been being taught, they really don't make sense. They're not logical. And then they start looking for another source. Well, you remember how we started this study tonight. When we look at the origin of the universe, how many sources can there be? There can only be one source, but that source can only be one of two things. Either it has evolved from nothing to where it is today, or it was spoken into existence by God and has been preserved by the natural processes He set in motion. That's where we're going to pick up next week. Appreciate your comments and your attention.